So, first of all, Rupert Spira, thank you enormously for agreeing to take part in this interview.
Not at all, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And it's worth pointing out to those who are reading the transcript that this interview has been arranged by Watkins' Mind, Body and Spirit magazine to promote your new book, The Happiness You Seek is... sorry, You Are the Happiness You Seek, I beg your pardon. And we're recording this on the 16th of February 2022. The expectation is that an edited transcript of this interview will find its way into Watkins magazine for July of this year. And then the intention is to lightly edit the whole transcript and put it on the internet for people to read at that point. So that's the, if you like, the background. Rupert, perhaps the place to begin with is the book. Now, it's not your first book. You're the author of a number of books. I found this personally, it felt slightly different as a book, slightly different in terms of tone, slightly different in terms of content. So one of the things that I noticed immediately was you spoke much more about your own experiences, and you reproduced in the book, I think, a number of stories that I've heard occasionally from you live and so forth. Was this all a deliberate decision on your part? Did you want to write a slightly different kind of book, and if so, why?
Yes, David, you're absolutely right. I've written, as you say, a number of books, and they're all dealing with the same understanding from slightly different points of view. I wanted to make this book as accessible as possible. Over the last 10 or 12 years that I've been speaking about these matters in general, but over the last couple of years in particular, when my meetings have gone online and as a result have been available to a much wider audience, I've been receiving questions from a much wider field of people than I previously did, and questions from people who are not necessarily familiar with the non-dual understanding in whatever tradition. And it's been, I've been very touched by these questions and these meetings over the last couple of years online, because I've had to try to formulate the understanding in such a way as to make it easily accessible to people who are not familiar with the normal terminology that many of us who are more familiar with these ideas take for granted. So I think that the book was really an extension of the process that has taken place for me on my online meetings to try and make this understanding both more experiential and more available to a larger number of people.
That's interesting. And how far was that specifically influenced by the experience of the pandemic?
I think it was very closely influenced, as I say, because during the pandemic, people have had access to my online meetings that would never normally have access to my live meetings. So I've been speaking not just to the choir, not even just to the congregation, but to the people outside the church altogether. And this has been it's been a very interesting and very good exercise for me. I have not been able to take for granted any of the ideas or the language that I might normally take for granted when speaking to the choir or the congregation. So I think that the book has really, it's a kind of parallel, it's been a parallel process. And in fact, I wrote it during the pandemic. The introduction, in fact, begins on the very first day of the pandemic, I think the 20th of March. So yes, it was very closely connected with my experience during online meetings during the pandemic, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly unhesitatingly recommend that book. If somebody said, which book of Rupert Spira should I begin with? I would unhesitatingly recommend that book because it does lay it out in a very straightforward, very logical fashion.
Yes, I'm glad that you say that, David. People sometimes ask me, which of your books would you recommend? And then I hesitate. Yes. And then I think, well, don't read The Nature of Consciousness unless you're already deeply into these matters. You'll get lost. You'll be put off. You'll think this is very, very, very deep and intellectual. And of course, it's it need not be intellectual at all. So I'm glad that you feel that. And I think when the book comes out, this is the book that I will recommend to someone who asks me, comes fresh to this understanding with the question, which book should I start with? I think I'll recommend this one as well. So I'm glad you feel the same way.
The other thing I felt was that in terms of tone, there is a little bit more Western culture in the book. In some of the authors, for example, whom you've chosen for extracts at the beginning of chapters. And I saw thinkers for the first time. It didn't surprise me to see people like Plotinus and Meister Eckhart and so forth, because one of the questions that I would love to have asked you in the past, so let me ask it now, is precisely the connection with the Western mystical tradition. Or perhaps connection is the wrong word, but parallels or reminiscences. Because I think there's a feeling in some quarters that non-dualism is a fundamentally Eastern, or at least non-Western idea, and that you have to convert to Buddhism or go and sit in an ashram in India and learn Sanskrit if you're ready to understand it. And I thought the tone of the book, you didn't actually say this, but the tone of the book was rather to correct that misunderstanding.
The tone of the book was?
The tone of the book was helped to correct that misunderstanding.
You're absolutely right. Not that was my intention, my conscious intention, but you're right. Like you probably and many of our generation, we went east for this understanding, if not physically, at least philosophically.
Yeah.
And that involved, certainly for me, it involved a degree of rejection of my own culture. In my own culture, this is a naive and oversimplification, but what I saw in my own culture was my own Western upbringing was the results of materialist thinking. And I sort of turned my back on that and went to the East for what I considered to be the birthplace, the origin, the heart of the true non-dual understanding. And really, philosophically, I did go to India once, but I went philosophically for a good 20 or so years before I came back, so to speak, to my own culture and started reading particularly some of the Christian mystics and the early Greek philosophers, Parmenides, Plotinus. And I realized it's all there.
It is all there.
It's all there. And not only that, having been brought up in England, having spent 10 years in English boarding schools, going to chapel every morning, knowing many of the psalms and the hymns and the prayers off by heart, all of this I rejected as being dualistic. And when I came back to these prayers and hymns and the psalms, I realized, no, it's all there, albeit encoded, less explicit than it is in the East. But once you have the key, so to speak, it unlocks the Western tradition, and it connected with something that I didn't realize how deep the Western tradition was in me, and it unlocked this connection to my heart that I remember feeling as a boy. I remember feeling the love of God, as a sort of innocent, naive love of God as a boy, which I then turned away from as I began a more rational, investigative exploration of my experience. But I came back to it 20 years later with the understanding that I had gleaned from the East. And I found that the Western tradition was so rich and so poetic and so directly connected to the heart. So, yes, I think, although, as I say, it wasn't my conscious intention to bring the Western tradition more into the book, it has kind of paralleled a process that I've been through in the last 10 years. And I wanted to connect with people, with Westerners. Of course, the book is not just written for Westerners, but it will primarily be read by Westerners. And I wanted to help them to connect to their own very rich tradition.
That's fascinating. I suppose the distinction between the two traditions is that in the Western Christian tradition, after, I suppose, the Council of Nicaea or whatever, this became very much a minority point of view. Eckhart, of course, was accused of heresy.
Yes.
And there is a sense that this is all an underground tradition.
Yes, but funnily enough, David, to a certain extent, that is true of India as well. I was I used to think that non-duality was just the sort of the common religion of India, but actually that wasn't the case. Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, Atmananda Krishna Menon, their following was relatively small in their lifetime and consisted of a lot of Westerners. So even I don't know so much about Tibet and China, but certainly in India, the true non-dual understanding was not mainstream. There was still an awful lot of exoteric religions that predominated in the East, as they did and still do in the West.
That's interesting. This is a question of a slight tangent, but a lot of people come to non-duality and mysticism through an interest in esotericism. There are lots of people who are interested in the Neoplatonist or whatever. Some who are interested in the Western esoteric tradition, which more or less died out in the Renaissance and has been revived since, and so forth. So I think there's an interesting parallel there. And I hope I'm right in seeing the increasing interest in non-duality in the West as part of a wider move of consciousness.
Yes. I think one of perhaps the main thrust of the book, and hence the title, You Are the Happiness You Seek, is that like many people, used to think that enlightenment or awakening was some extraordinary mystical experience that one had attained as a result of effort, discipline, practice, and that it was something extremely rare that only 1 in a million people were qualified for. It took me years to realize that enlightenment is the exotic name for peace or joy. You know, you're familiar with this succinct Vedantic equation, Sat, Chit, Ananda, these three being, consciousness, and bliss, as it is normally or was normally translated, at least when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. I always thought of bliss as this extraordinary feeling that it just means peace.
Yes.
Or even as the Buddhists put it, cautious not to objectify the experience, they just refer to the absence of suffering.
Right.
So that's something I've tried to do in the book, to demystify enlightenment, to not to dumb it down in any way, but to divest it of all the exotic cultural packaging that it acquired from the exotic cultures of India and China and Japan and Tibet, and to show really that what is traditionally called enlightenment or awakening is simply the recognition of the nature of our being, not the being that we might become if we practice hard enough, but the being that each of us is now, but which we do not see clearly because of its entanglement with the content of experience. So I wanted to bring it very close, right down to earth, and within everybody's reach.
I think you've succeeded admirably in that. I think this demystification, it sounds a bit strange to say demystifying mysticism, but I think we know what we mean when we say that. And you just,
I think there's a nice book title in there, David, Demystifying Mysticism.
You're very welcome to it. You've just used the phrase absence of suffering, which I had written down as pretty much my next question. Because obviously you talk a lot in the book about happiness, and I've heard you talk about it many times online as well. What struck me was that you begin by talking about happiness, and then I think towards the conclusion of your argument, you say that in practice this can amount to absence of suffering. I'm not sure if you see that as being equivalent to happiness, but you certainly mention it as though it might be. So there's a broadening, I think, by any standards of the definition of happiness from something that we might naively think happiness, joy and laughter and that kind of thing, to almost a negative definition of happiness as the absence of something. I mean, is that a fair
Yes.
point?
Personally, the phrase "the absence of suffering" is not sufficient. It's technically correct, but it doesn't really, for me, it doesn't evoke the felt quality of peace and joy. What is being referred to is not really an absence of suffering. Of something. It's true. It cannot be objectified, and the danger. I think there are pros and cons of speaking positively of happiness or negatively as the absence of suffering. You could argue both cases. On balance, I would still go for speaking of happiness rather than the absence of suffering, although I respect the Buddhists who are cautious and prefer not to objectify happiness, because what I'm speaking of is not an objective state of happiness that comes and goes. It's the underlying peace and quiet joy that lies ever present in the background of experience. So although I like the word happiness because it's the common word. If we were to take a survey on the streets now, how many of the 8 billion of us are interested in enlightenment? 100,000 at the most. You ask how many people are interested in peace and happiness, all 8 billion people would say yes. But that's the common name that we know the recognition of our own being by. And so that's, in spite of its limitations, in spite of the possible dangers of objectifying it as a state, I still prefer to speak of happiness or peace.
No, I can see that. In fact, I wanted to follow up your point about 8 billion people, maybe to ask you whether you think there could be some fraying around the edges of that figure. For a start, there are many alternative traditions, aren't there, which see life as meaningless suffering, which see life as tragedy. Bertrand Russell's remark about the firm foundation of unyielding despair as a basis for life, all this kind of thing. The mental world of Greek tragedy, the view that human life is essentially tragic and meaningless.
Yeah. Most people lead lives of quiet desperation.
I wondered if you were going to say that. Yes.
Yes.
And you cite Albert Camus once in the book, and of course he's best known for his belief that the world is totally absurd and pointless. And the only philosophical question of any importance is, do I commit suicide or not?
Yes.
So I suppose my question about that, given that there is this tradition, is it possible to relate your thinking to it at all? Is this simply a misunderstanding of the nature of reality? Is it at one extreme, therefore completely wrong, or does this sort of view of life, which is very long established and very deeply held in some quarters, tragic, pointless view of life, is that any sort of attempt to reach what you would regard as happiness? Or the two things just exist in totally different spaces?
I think these attitudes, David, are the result of materialistic, dualistic thinking. For all their intelligence, many of these people did not penetrate through appearances to the reality in themselves, and as a result, didn't they may have intuited it, but didn't touch their innate peace, and therefore life was just a realm of despair. To take your example of committing suicide, it's a very extreme example, but why does one commit suicide? In order to free oneself from unbearable suffering.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly why one embarks on a spiritual path, to free oneself from suffering. In other words, to find happiness. So even one who commits suicide is doing so because of their love of happiness. they're just going about it, or stated in another way, on account of their desire to get rid of their suffering, which is a negative way of seeking happiness.
Yeah.
They want to be relieved of suffering. I call that the search for happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they are committing suicide, with no disrespect, I don't mean this in any way judgingly, is because their culture has not provided them with the means of finding the true source of happiness in themselves. And therefore they are in despair.
No, I can see that. And I mean, you must have read the Greek classics at your public school, I imagine.
Yes.
You know, and I guess the same is true of Beowulf and the Old English poetry tradition and so on. And there is this tradition of nobly facing one's fate, which dictated by the gods, which one can do nothing about. It's a very old perception of the universe.
Well, I think there is something to nobly facing one's fate. Total openness, total acceptance, total surrender. Whether you call it nobly accepting one's fate or surrendering to God, or that depends on one's framework. But I think that there is a place for this openness, this acceptance. That is a spiritual path. So I wouldn't criticize this approach.
I mean, what I was thinking of, for example, is the idea that there is, which you find in epic poetry from, I think, just about every culture, that there is nothing after this life, and that the best you can do is noble deeds and heroic acts, which mean that you will be remembered for ages thereafter. I suppose at a pinch you could argue that that's a type of search for happiness, or at least to die happy.
I think it's a perpetuation of the same misunderstanding, same dualistic misunderstanding in this life. It comes from a basic belief, a fundamental misunderstanding. What I essentially am is a physical body. And that when this physical body dies, what I essentially am will die with it. That is the fundamental misunderstanding. That what we are is a temporary, finite self made out of matter, made out of the body. And the idea of leading a good life so that you leave acts of, leave behind a good life as an act of posterity. This is an extension, a noble extension of that same idea. But I think I think it's based on the same misunderstanding.
It's interesting. I mean, that some of what we've just been talking about leads to another question I had, because there are people who have devoted their lives, or part of their lives anyway, and often their deaths, to endurance and heroism, to self-sacrifice for others or for an ideal that they cling to. I mean, we see that, I suppose, in the heroic age of poetry, but we also see it in modern terms with political martyrs and that kind of thing. I mean, here in France, there's still quite an important memory of the martyrs of the resistance, people who voluntarily took on almost insane risks, and in almost all cases were betrayed, imprisoned, tortured, and mostly murdered. People like the great resistance leader Jean Moulin,
Yes.
who was a great personal hero of mine because he was a civil servant. But I mean, these are people who weren't, I think, by any reasonable standard, seeking happiness. I mean, they were doing something that they felt was of absolutely overwhelming importance compared to anything else they could do in their lives.
Yes.
Can you somehow accommodate that in your...
Yeah, very much so, David,
Yeah.
very much so. But all these acts that you mentioned, they were all acts of self-transcendence.
Yeah.
And what inspired these people to engage in these tremendously courageous and heroic acts? It was an intuition that the meaning of their lives lay in something beyond their own personal life story. So I think that these acts are in fact inspired by an intuition of the transcendent nature of our essential self. Now, they of course wouldn't formulate it in these terms, but I think that these kinds of acts, these self-sacrificial acts, these acts of great courage where people lay down their lives for a cause that they believe in, this is an example of the impulse to self-transcendence. They are transcending their personal lives for the sake of something bigger. They are surrendering their life for something that they consider nobler, bigger. It's an act of self-transcendence.
And the obvious question is, how do you relate transcendence, self-transcendence, to happiness? I mean, are they two aspects of the same thing?
Exactly the same thing. Yeah, yes, because in order to find true happiness, one must. I wouldn't really, in this context, I wouldn't describe it as self-transcendence. In other words, I wouldn't suggest that in order to find peace or happiness, we had to go beyond ourselves. I would suggest that we have to go to that in ourselves which is prior to ourself as a temporary, finite self, prior to everything that defines us as a person. That it's the same, that it's transcendence. We have to. The way I would describe it is you have to go so deeply into yourself that you penetrate through all the layers of experience that define us as a person: thoughts, images, feelings, activities, relationships, histories, memories, etc. You penetrate through those layers until you get to that irreducible, essential element of yourself, which is utterly intimate, but impersonal in the sense that it doesn't share any of the qualities of yourself as a limited person. That is transcendence. Except to access this transcendent being, we haven't gone outward or away from ourselves. We have gone deeply into ourselves. But as when we travel backwards or inwards, so to speak, to this deepest, most fundamental, irreducible aspect of ourself, and we come to the pure being, that is the experience of happiness. That is the experience of peace. That is the source of happiness. It is that happiness is the nature of being. So I feel that these two movements, that the transcendence that is displayed in these great acts of courage, and the inward-facing path that the mystic takes, where they go to that which is prior to all the personal elements of their experience, are in fact two ways of traversing the same circle. Both involve transcendence. One goes outwards, so to speak, beyond themselves. The other goes inwards to access that which is prior to their self as a person. It's the same act of transcendence. So I think they're very deeply connected.
The obvious follow-up question is that people do sacrifice themselves for all sorts of causes. Some are heroes of the French resistance, others fly airplanes into skyscrapers and this kind of thing. Your formulation, I wouldn't say puts everyone on the same level, I think that would be unfair, but doesn't distinguish motive particularly. It doesn't comment on motive. People who are reaching within themselves to find the essence of themselves and do something which results in their own destruction, but in the furtherance of a cause, includes, if we think back through history, the good, the bad, and the downright appalling. Is your formulation to be understood as simply putting to one side moral issues of the objective of this sacrifice and whether we regard it as acceptable or not?
I think if we were to take if we were to take one of these individuals that engaged in one of these horrendous acts and ask them, what is your motive? We would find, of course, they wouldn't formulate it like this, but they did what they did because it was their happiness to do so. They didn't do it because it would make them suffer. They believed in it. They thought that they were delighted. That the people that flew the planes into they were all delighted. It made them happy. So it's a profound misunderstanding, of course. But nevertheless, their motive, if you trace back their motive, it was the same. They thought this is the path to happiness. And of course, then the way they pursue that happiness is profoundly ignorant, because it's based on ignorance. I am a temporary, finite, independently existing self.
Yeah.
But the core motive, I would suggest, is the same.
I think this is a slight tangent, but I mean, there's been quite a lot of work done in France on returning jihadists from Syria. And they've been interviewed and asked precisely this sort of question. And beyond the rather adolescent searching for adventure and this kind of thing, which I think can be incorporated in your, in your terminology quite well. There's also precisely a longing for transcendence, because they believe that they're going to fight in a battle at the end of the world, which will determine everything for eternity. And there's been a lot of, coming back to your point about materialism, there's been a lot of worry, I think, in Western Europe, I'm not sure about in England, that we can't offer these people very much else. I mean, they're being offered membership of, I don't know, the Fellowship of the Ring or something, and all we can offer them is, is a consumer culture. So I do think there is something here. It's very badly expressed in our society. But I do think some of these people are fumbling towards some of the things that you are talking about.
I agree. We of course we have to be very delicate the way we express this, not in any way to glorify.
Absolutely not.
So of course we have to be careful. But I think you're absolutely right that the people that engage in these atrocious activities are at the deepest level motivated by some sense of by an intuition that transcendence gives their life meaning.
Yeah.
Even if it means blowing yourself up with a suicide vest and then entering into a realm in the afterlife, that gives them meaning, and it's a meaning that their lives in this world are impoverished and miserable. So they think that by engaging in these actions, they are going to transcend the misery and poverty of this world and enter some glorious afterlife. The impulse is the impulse to transcend their suffering.
Yeah. This is what they say, and our materialist society finds it very hard to believe them.
Well, it's true. It's true that of course, our culture, I cannot in any way, I'm talking about our culture in England, our culture in Europe, cannot in any way be equated with the kind of jihadist world view. But our culture doesn't have anything very substantial to offer in terms of true understanding or lasting peace and happiness. We have, as you say, kind of consumer mentality. The more you have, the happier you will be. And this is obviously not the case. As I say, I'm not equating this with a jihadist viewpoint at all. But I think many people, let's not be quite as extreme as the jihadists, but many people in our culture now feel that our culture is kind of meaningless. Many people, the extent of the despair and sorrow in our culture comes because the younger generations have inherited the fruit of materialism, and they understand, even if they don't formulate it in these terms, they understand that it cannot give them what they truly want, which is peace and joy. And this, for many people, leads to despair, and in a few cases, even more extreme. But it leads to despair, to drugs, to suicide, often to violence. And our culture our culture, of course, condemns such behavior without really understanding how it has contributed to such behavior. And isn't able, at least at the moment, isn't able to offer profoundly satisfying answers to these disillusioned people.
I presume you're familiar with the whole disenchantment of the world argument, since Max Weber, Charles Taylor, and people like that, which has always seemed to me to be very, very coherent. Our ancestors lived in a world that meant something. One can exaggerate the degree to which ordinary people were conscious of it, but our ancestors lived in a magical world. We no longer do.
Well, I think it's to a degree, it's true that our ancestors felt a less clearly defined sense of individual identity. But the boundaries of their self was more porous than is ours. They felt a deeper connection with their community and with their environment. Nowadays, the individual is sealed up, so to speak, in a shell of independent existence. And so the sense of separation, both from one another and from the environment, I think is generally much stronger now than it was for our ancestors. And of course, the extent of the sorrow that people feel on the inside and the extent of the conflict we witness between families, communities, and nations on the outside is a direct consequence of this feeling of being an isolated, separate individual.
That's interesting. I mean, you've already anticipated a question I had because you talked about suicide. But I think that really is a logical continuation of what we were just discussing, the sense of despair. I think we've all met people who say things like, I hate myself, I hate my life, I want to die. I still remember somebody I knew at university who said, every morning I wake up, I open my eyes and I think, oh God, not another day. How am I going to get through it? Which is probably not an entirely 20th century, 21st century phenomenon either. I think people have been feeling that for as long as they've been people. Would you say that your remarks on suicide have more or less covered that angle? Or would you want to add anything else about depression and the feeling that there's just no point in living anymore?
Yes, I think unhappiness in general, but deep depression in particular, comes from feeling locked in to oneself as an isolated individual. All you've got are your own personal thoughts and feelings. The access to your own being, your own essential being, prior to thoughts and feelings, has been, it's never completely cut off, but it's been almost completely cut off. So that all one has is the content of one's experience, the content of thoughts and feelings, and with no access to one's being, which lies behind that, so to speak, and which is inherently peaceful. And this feeling of being cut off from one's essential being is enough to induce despair and meaninglessness.
Do you think, perhaps this is an unfair question, but do you think that an awareness of non-duality could have an actual healing effect on people?
When you say an awareness of non-duality,
well, I'm carefully not trying to imply that non-duality could be a form of therapy, although you may have views on that. But clearly, the beginning of the recognition of one's true nature, for example, which is a phrase you often use, could, at least in theory, have a therapeutic effect on people.
Yes.
I don't know whether you've had any experience of that happen.
Absolutely. Let's imagine that someone comes to you in the grips of suffering, overcome with emotion. Now, in many cases, it's not appropriate to ask such a person, what is it that is aware of your experience? Some more relative approach, isn't it? But because of you've asked the question, let's imagine that someone was to come to you in such a condition, and you felt that it was appropriate to say to them, okay, you've told me now, you've been speaking for 5 minutes about your circumstances, your feelings, your relationships. But what is it that is aware of all of these? And this person was to pause. And in that pause, instead of their attention being lost in their feelings, that their attention relaxes. They ask themselves the question, but what is it that is aware of my feelings? And at that moment, they ceased being immersed in their emotions, and they take a step back, so to speak. They touch in themselves. They visit briefly their essential nature, which is awareness. Now, it may be very brief, that the habit of emotion may immediately return again and obscure this brief glimpse. But there would have been, the question you asked would have just introduced a pause in the stream of their suffering, which would give them brief access to the background of awareness. And in that moment, there would have been relief from their suffering. All you need to do is ask the question again next time you meet this person, but what is it that is aware of your sorrow? Pause, they go back to the background of peace. And once you've had a taste of the nature of that which is aware of our experience, our interest is awakened. Then you can begin to say to someone, well, stay there. Don't be so interested in what you are aware of. Give your love and interest to that which is aware. What are its qualities?
It's interesting because the original conception of philosophy back in the time of Plato and Aristotle and so forth was actually as a kind of therapy.
Exactly. It was,
and people went to the academy or whatever as they saw it to be cured.
Yes, it was deeply connected with our actual experience. It wasn't an abstract process of reasoning. Yes.
So that'd be very interesting if we'd come back to that. Now, one thing you say often, and you said it several times in the book about happiness, is that we shouldn't assume that objects, relationships, etc., will necessarily bring us happiness. I just want to, I wouldn't say push back, but ask you to comment on what I think is a reasonable argument here, that there's nothing wrong, given the choice, of acting in such a way as to naturally be made happy as opposed to naturally be made unhappy. For example, I was making these notes up. I remembered the last art exhibition I went to, which was the Botticelli exhibition in Paris, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And coming out of the gallery feeling, this is wonderful, I've just looked beauty in the face, and seeing a pile of rubbish bags on the pavement, which had not yet been collected, were disgorging some of their contents. Now, I mean, there were purists, and I read them, who would say that you should be indifferent to external events of all kinds, and everything is fundamentally the same. But I would prefer to, if I have the free use of my time, I prefer to pursue Botticelli rather than some sordid urban landscape. Am I making a mistake there?
No, I don't think you are. Ultimately, yes, of course, everything is of the same nature. The Botticelli and the rubbish bags. However, a work of art has a specific or what I consider to be a work of art, a true work of art, has a specific function in society, namely to reveal reality, to take us to the experience of reality. And that's what you experienced.
Hmm.
I couldn't improve on your description. You said, I felt I looked beauty in the face. Well, beauty is one of the names of reality.
Hmm.
And the purpose of a work of art is to take us, not intellectually, not rationally, but to take us viscerally, as Cézanne said, to give us a taste of nature's eternity, to give us a taste of that which is eternal or real in nature. And that is the purpose of a work of art. Now, it's not the purpose of a pile of rubbish bags. The purpose of a pile of rubbish bags is to collect rubbish from people's homes. It doesn't have a sacred function. That doesn't mean to say that in the ultimate analysis, the reality of the rubbish bags is any different from the reality of a Botticelli painting. But at a more relative level, there is a profound difference between them.
Hmm. Now, if we take that argument a stage further, or if you like, a stage down, we're not always talking about high art. We're not always surrounded by beauty, but we may be surrounded by things which are more or less pleasant to experience. I mean, I can't remember, I was writing some notes for this interview, listening to some undemanding music, so such as, was not going to interfere with the process of thought. And if someone had suggested, well, why don't you listen to some, I don't know, Norwegian satanic death metal or something, I would have said, no, thank you very much. So it's not necessarily a case of high art versus rubbish bags. I just wonder if there's room in your way of thinking for the sort of choices that we make pretty much every day, that being with this person is more pleasant than being with that person, or experiencing this music is more pleasant than that music, or this film than that film, or something, without any real sense that one is doing anything transcendental, but one is pursuing, albeit perhaps wrongly, I don't know, but one is pursuing just a slightly happier life, a slightly more pleasant set of experiences. In other words, we don't have to go to necessarily to your concept of beauty, but just experiences which are a little, a little less, or a little happier, or experiences which are a little more pleasurable than others that we might alternatively choose.
Yes, but there's a difference between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is something that is an experience that is pleasing to our senses. But that doesn't, and it's very often mistaken for happiness, but it's a very different experience.
I suppose, yeah, sorry, please go on.
Well, one can be miserable lying on a Caribbean beach.
Yeah.
And one can be blissfully happy sitting in a bus stop in the pouring rain. So I think we have to make a distinction between a pleasurable experience is one that is very tailored to the body, that is pleasant for the body. But it doesn't always equate to happiness. And it's not. Sometimes they coincide. They're often mistaken for one another. But what we really want is not pleasure; it's happiness.
Yeah, I suppose my question is there anything wrong with trying to organize your life so that you have more pleasurable experiences than unpleasant experiences?
Not at all. No, not at all. I'm not, in this approach, I don't suggest that desire, for instance, is wrong. That one shouldn't desire, as you say, a pleasant experience, be it a relationship, an activity, a place to live, or no. There's nothing in this approach that would suggest that was in any way wrong. What I would suggest is that it would be mistaken to seek such an experience or object for the sake of happiness.
I can see that.
It's quite possible, for instance, that a desire comes from happiness, that is initiated by happiness. It does not go towards it, but it comes from it. If we approach any object with the expectation or demand that it will produce happiness for us, although it may, when we acquire the object or the substance or the relationship, it's true that the search for happiness comes to an end. Why? Because we've got the object we were seeking, and as a result of that, we experience happiness. We wrongly attribute the happiness experienced to the object acquired. We don't realize that all the object did for us, the object that we acquired, the substance, the activity, the relationship, all it did for us was to put an end to the activity of seeking. And when the activity of seeking comes to an end, the mind comes briefly to an end. And as a result, our true nature of happiness, in which previously was hidden by the activity of seeking, shines. And we experience happiness. But we don't realize that the happiness experienced is a taste of our own being. We think it is given by the object. So, and so as a result, after a while, the effect of the power, the capacity that the object has to put an end to seeking diminishes. Seeking rises again because its source has not been clearly seen and cut off. The seeking arises again. We remember last time I went for that object, that substance, or that relationship. I felt happiness, so I'll go for it again. This time I need a little bit more of it. And sure enough, when we get the object or the substance, the activity of seeking comes to an end. Our true nature of happiness briefly shines. We wrongly attribute the happiness to the object or the substance acquired. And in this way, a cycle of seeking, the acquisition of the object, satisfaction, and addiction slowly builds up. But we never, however much of the object or the activity or the substance, it never gives us what we want, which is not just moments of happiness, it is lasting happiness.
I can see that. I guess that's enough happiness. Perhaps we could say a word about suffering. I'm going to quote one of the sentences in your book that struck me. You say, one with a deep interest in truth or reality does not see suffering as something incorrect, wrong, or problematic. Rather, they welcome it as a reminder that they have invested their happiness in objective experience, which is rather what you were just saying in relation to happiness. What made me slightly hesitate was the use of the word suffering and the use of the word welcome in the same few lines. I wondered if there's a risk of encouraging the belief that some people have, for example, that they're born to suffer, or that they're born to be tragic victims, or indeed a sense of neurosis, and the belief that you find on the fringes of some religions, actually, that suffering is good, that you ought to actually seek out suffering because it's good for the soul. I know that's not what you mean.
It's definitely not what I intended. I think that when I said such a person welcomes their suffering, but I then qualified that by saying because it allows them to see that they've invested their happiness. So but yes, you're absolutely right. I do not mean, and I hope I didn't imply that one should simply sort of passively accept one's suffering as one's lot in life, and simply try to welcome it. That is not what's intended. Actually, it's not really possible to welcome suffering, because suffering is by definition resistance. So. And resistance is the opposite of welcoming. So if we were to stop resisting, so let's take a particular situation in our life, in a relationship, for instance. We resist what is taking place in our relationship. As a result, we suffer. If we were to cease resisting what was taking place in our relationship and we were to embrace it or welcome it, our suffering would come to an end, because our suffering is only contained in our resistance to the situation. It's not the situation itself that causes the suffering, it is our resistance to it. So if resistance is replaced with welcoming, there's no question of welcoming suffering, because there is no longer any suffering to welcome. So sometimes you hear people talk about welcoming suffering. Well, if you can welcome the suffering, why not welcome the situation that's causing the suffering? And then there would be no suffering to welcome or not.
I mean, here you come back, I think, inevitably to things like martyrdom and to the more extreme forms of the lives of the saints of different religions and so forth, and to extreme forms of asceticism. We tend to think of suffering, I mean, certainly that I think is the way that you describe it in your book, as being essentially mental suffering, resistance to situations we don't like. There is, of course, the other type of suffering, which is more common in the world.
Yes, I make a clear distinction, David, between psychological or emotional suffering and physical pain.
Yeah.
And whilst I think psychological or emotional suffering, its source is the overlooking or forgetting of our true nature, and is ultimately, therefore, it's referred to in the Vedantic tradition as ignorance, not in a pejorative sense, but it comes from the ignoring of reality, or the ignoring of what we. It is essentially a mistaken belief, a mistaken sense of one's own identity. Whereas physical pain, I would suggest it's an intelligent. It's a sign of intelligence. It's not a sign of ignorance. It's the intelligence, not only pain, but danger as well. If one is in danger, or if somebody in one's care is in danger, one's resistance to it is not a sign of ignorance. It is a sign of intelligence. So for this reason, I make a very clear distinction between the resistance, because they're both resistances. Pain is a physical resistance, which is an intelligent response of the body, whereas suffering is also an intelligent signal in the mind. So pain is to the body what suffering is to the mind. When we feel pain or danger to the body, it's a signal that the body requires attention. Yes. Even if it's the experience of hunger, that's a mild experience of pain, or at least discomfort, which signals it's time to eat or drink. So that's an intelligent signal from the body. Suffering is a symmetrical situation in the mind. When we're suffering, it's an intelligent signal from the mind telling us you have overlooked the nature of your own being, and as a result you have invested your desire for happiness in objective experience. Pause. Instead of just seeking satisfaction in the object, which can never fully satisfy you, pause. Investigate the source of your suffering.
Yeah, I suppose it has to be said that there's a third type of suffering. I mean, the suffering of people who are imprisoned or tortured or subject to the evil activities of others. There's a lot of that in the world. And there are some people who've risen above that. I mean, there are people who've written memoirs of their time in concentration camps and this kind of thing. Whether they would see that as something that they welcomed, or whether they would see it as something that was positive. I mean, I think it depends very much who you are and how strong you are psychologically. But obviously there is an ultimate kind of suffering I think most of us would sensibly seek to avoid if we could.
Well, yes, but all those are extreme examples of where physical pain, discomfort, danger, abuse. So the kind of resistance one would feel to such an experience is entirely legitimate.
Yeah.
I wouldn't begin to judge that kind of resistance.
Oh, that's a very useful clarification. Another subject that you cover in the book, and that I've heard you speak a lot about, is time, or rather the non-existence of time. You say the mind imagines time in the book, and I've heard you express yourself very forthrightly to questioners on the absence of time and the extent to which it's a human construct. I wonder what you think about some of the logical consequences of the non-existence of time. If you have ultimately no time, then the concept of cause and effect cannot exist, because cause and effect require time. But ethics can't exist either, because there are no consequences. Consequences require time. We can't learn anything. We can't regret anything, and so forth. Now, I'm quite prepared to have you say, no, it's much more complicated than that. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. But when you subtract the dimension of time from our understanding of the world, an awful lot goes with it, surely.
Yes. I don't deny the relative existence of time for practical purposes.
Mm-hmm.
It's more psychological time, by which I mean the time that is required to have a sense of ourself as a temporary, finite, separate self, which is made up of its history, its thoughts, its feelings. It's the psychological time that perpetuates the sense of separation that I'm referring to, not the relative use of let's call it functional time, practical time that enables us, for instance, to agree to meet at 3:00 in the afternoon for an interview. That makes relative use of the idea of time for practical purposes, but we don't have to buy into the absolute reality of time in order to agree to meet at a certain time. Whereas the sense of being a separate self depends upon time for its existence. The suffering, for instance. So for instance, and we're not talking about physical pain, talking about psychological suffering. If you now, let's remove time from your experience. It's very easy to imagine that. Just remove your memory. You don't have a memory. Would it be possible for you to suffer now psychologically?
It would be very difficult.
Or can you give me an instance of suffering? Can you try to give me an example of how you might suffer now in the absence of memory?
Only by anticipation. Only by.
How would you anticipate anything if you didn't have memory to refer to?
It would be very difficult.
Give me an example of something that you could anticipate without referring to your memory. I mean, take dinner this evening, for instance. Could you imagine dinner this evening if you didn't have a memory to refer to?
No, I mean, clearly you can only imagine that by reference to dinners you've had in the past.
So when we remove the past, when we remove memory, we also remove anticipation. So now remove these two. It's enough to remove memory because it's implied that anticipation is then no longer possible. Could you suffer psychologically? Of course, you could be in physical pain or danger, but could you suffer psychologically?
I think only, as you say, if you were already in some situation. I mean, if you assume that you had lost your memory, but subjective time was still continuing, then something that happened perhaps a few seconds ago, you'd think, oh my God, I'm afraid that what is happening to me now will continue.
But that requires memory. Remove the possibility of what happened 2 minutes ago or 2 seconds ago or 2 days ago. Could you suffer?
No, that would be impossible because you'd have no frame of reference.
So we think that our suffering takes place in the now, and we escape from it through thinking into the past or future. The opposite is the case. The now is the only place suffering can never stand. It only exists with reference to the past and future. So strangely, tragically, ironically, most of us escape the now where we think our suffering takes place, into an imaginary past or future. Really, we should be withdrawing our investment in the past and future and returning to the sanctity of the now, which is our refuge, the only place where suffering can't stand. And this is why the now, the present moment, and so on, is such an important aspect of so many spiritual practices. And even if it's not stated explicitly, for instance, a more relative approach, let's say, which is not something I particularly recommend, but let's say you were to focus on your breathing. Or someone is suffering intensely because of a relationship situation. Someone suggests to them they focus on their breathing. That is actually it's a kind of halfway stage. It takes their attention away from the past and the future, because their breathing is an experience that's happening now. So that's a skillful means of bringing their attention to the now. All that's necessary then is to take one further step back from one's breathing, all the way back to one's true nature.
That's fascinating. I mean, it leads to the obvious question, I suppose. We've got a double sense of time here. I mean, there's time in the absolute sense, you say, it doesn't exist. And pragmatic time, which has to exist so that we can make an appointment for an interview. Would it be unfair to say that in the end, what really matters to us is how we perceive time, is pragmatic time, because we have to live in the world, we have things to do, we have appointments, we have to get up in the morning and so on. And that this non-duality stuff is all very interesting, but it's a way of seeing things that doesn't necessarily have much impact on our daily lives. Now, you've given an example a few seconds ago of how it could in relieving suffering. But do you first of all think that these two conceptions of time are compatible? Or do you get a headache attempting to hold them in your mind at the same time?
No, I think they're entirely compatible. It's perfectly easy to lead a very functional life, turning up to your meetings on time and yet not have a sense of psychological time, not have one's happiness invested in future experience. And not only do I think that this attitude is not compatible with everyday life, on the contrary, it's the only attitude to me that makes sense of everyday life. If you take the suffering we experience on the inside, the conflict that is experienced between individuals, families, communities, and nations on the outside, and the exploitation and degradation of the earth. Take these three factors: suffering, conflict, and the degradation of the earth. All three, I would suggest, can be traced back to our mistaken assumption that we are temporary, finite, separate selves, separate from one another, separate from the environment, separate from God, by which I mean the ultimate reality. Whereas the recognition of our true nature, and by definition, with that recognition comes the felt understanding that we share our essential identity, not only with all people, but with all animals and with all things. That recognition is the ultimate cure for suffering, conflict, and our relationship to the environment. So I think it is not only possible to live a practical life with this understanding, I think it's the only chance we have of leading a decent, ethical, creative life.
Which, of course, brings us neatly to the individual, about which you have spoken a great deal. You say in your book, the individual is an illusion, not an entity in its own right. And you talk, as you've often talked in your lectures, about the apparently separate self. You've just talked about, if you like, overcoming this sense of separateness as a way out of suffering. It's something I've heard you talk about a number of times. But I presume you wouldn't deny that it is possible for the apparently separate self, nonetheless, to feel positive about their apparently separate existence, that as well as suffering, there is joy and love and passion and drama and excitement and challenge and all this kind of thing.
Yes. David, I don't deny individuality.
Mm-hmm.
I deny that ultimately independently existing selves and objects, but I acknowledge individuality as unique expressions of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't, with this understanding, we don't cease functioning as individuals. We continue to think, to feel, to act, to perceive and relate, but we no longer do so on behalf of the fears, the demands, the expectations, the desires, the neuroses of an apparently separate self. We do so on behalf of the qualities, if we can call them qualities, that are inherent in our true nature, namely peace, love, joy, beauty. So all our faculties as an individual remain. And in fact, the individual functions much more sanely, much more intelligently, because its activities are no longer thwarted by the tyranny of separation. So we continue to function. We function much better in the world. Our individuality is used in the service of truth and love and peace. It's no longer used in the service of the neuroses of the separate self.
Yes, I mean, again, as with time, you're talking about different ways of looking at a concept that we've been brought up to think of as one concept. I don't think there's anything in my upbringing, for example, which would have encouraged me to think in the way that you've just described. It's something, I wouldn't say alien, but it is something which takes a little getting used to.
Yes, this understanding, it's not, I say not yet mainstream, implying that hopefully one day it will be more mainstream. And indeed, I think it will. How many people 50 years ago had ever heard of meditation, yoga? These 50 years ago, these activities were mindfulness had not yet become yoga was not yet common. No one had ever heard of Zen. Now, mindfulness, yoga, some kind of meditation practice, these are everyday household words. So our culture has changed a lot. I know that what I'm speaking of is even one step more. It's deeper than what people normally consider or associate with mindfulness or Zen or yoga. But it's this understanding, Zen, mindfulness, yoga, and so on, that is now part of our culture, have paved the way for this deeper understanding that I'm speaking of. And certainly if my experience is anything to go by, the number of people, I've been speaking about these matters, for 10 or 12 years, the number of people that are interested in these matters is just growing exponentially. So I feel that this understanding is beginning to, I think it would be, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was mainstream, but it's beginning to filter into the mainstream.
It's very encouraging. I mean, one of the problems, you mentioned mindfulness, and there's already a bit of a backlash against mindfulness and yoga and so forth, on the basis that they're turning, ironically enough, into commodities. They're turning into precisely what you warn us about.
Yes.
I don't think that'll happen to non-duality. I certainly hope it doesn't. But there is a danger that all of this will be banalized and will simply be absorbed frictionlessly into a consumer society. And people will be selling us mindfulness and selling us yoga. Yes.
Well, it's true that the ego can appropriate almost anything, if not anything, and use it to perpetuate itself. And that will probably happen. In fact, it is already happening. I see it to an extent with the non-dual understanding. But, and I think that is just an inevitable consequence of this understanding going out more into the mainstream. But that doesn't mean to say that it will become corrupted by the mainstream. I don't think it will. My experience, for instance, these last couple of years, where I've been holding meetings online, and until 2 years ago, I was speaking, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, if not to the choir, certainly to the congregation. But in the last 2 years, I've had conversations and interviews with the Metropolitan Police Force, the Nationwide Building Society, Alcoholics Anonymous, sports personalities, people way outside the field within which I was accustomed to speaking. And that's because this understanding is finding its way. I mean, can you imagine the Metropolitan Police? They have set up an organization now within the Metropolitan Police to deal with mental health issues in the police. And they are regularly asking me to contribute. Nationwide Building Society, Alcoholics Anonymous. So these are signs of this understanding finding its way into areas of the community which even 5 years ago would have been unheard of.
That's great news. I've listened to some of your podcasts with, I must admit, at first sight, quite surprising hosts, but nonetheless very interesting and very useful discussions.
Yes, and these are, you've probably noticed, these are people, they're so sincere. I mean, I'm so moved talking to these groups who very often have no prior understanding of the non-dual traditions, or nevertheless they're struggling in their lives, and they so far haven't found a remedy for their suffering. They're so open, they're so sincere, they ask such profound questions, and there's no sense that they want to somehow appropriate this understanding, and that they're really genuinely open to it. I've been deeply touched on a number of occasions by the depth and sincerity of the people in these groups.
That's very interesting. I suppose certainly the last topic I was going to put to you, I suppose a lot of this comes together. We talked about concepts of time, we talked about concepts of the individual, of suffering and happiness and so forth. Some of the writers that you've instanced from the Western tradition, I get the impression that they try to explain these things, or they see themselves as trying to explain these things. And beyond a certain point, they throw their hands up and they say, I can't do it. Plotinus, if I remember correctly, wrote books about how he couldn't write anything.
Yes.
And there is, it seems to me, there's a real question, like when we were talking about the difference between the two concepts of time, or the two concepts of the individual and so forth, about how much it is reasonable to expect language to do and how much it is reasonable to expect human concepts to do. I don't know what your experience is of talking to ordinary people about these things. It's often difficult. I mean, I think more and more about Wittgenstein saying, look, there are just some things that we can't talk about, so
yes,
let's be mystics instead. No,
it's a very... Sorry,
no, I was just going to say, I think the consequence of that would be that, as well as the teaching you do, in which you try to bring in a very clear, I've always found this very clear, very structured, very organized fashion, some of these issues, is there nonetheless a dimension, a component which cannot be transmitted by language?
Absolutely, yes, yes. There's a difference between words that try to describe reality and words that try to evoke reality. words cannot describe reality because reality is whole, and words, by definition, fragment. Words describe the fragments, the parts of the whole. So, really, if one wanted to speak honestly, truthfully about reality, one would remain silent. One cannot say a single true word about reality. Does that mean that we should never speak about these matters? Well, in my opinion, no. So, some people do think that's and they remain silent. I respect that. As the Zen, you may have heard me quote, I don't remember who it was, but a Zen master who said, if I speak, I tell a lie. If I remain silent, I am a coward. Picasso said the same thing. All art tells a lie, but it leads us to the truth. So I'm one of those that believe that it is valid to speak about these matters. I would acknowledge straight away up front, not a single word I say is absolutely true. Nevertheless, if I had not heard the words of the non-dual understanding, I would have remained suffering. It wouldn't have helped me. So I think all teachings, even the highest teachings, make a degree of concession. And if one isn't willing to make a concession to language, then one should not speak. But I think that it's valid to make that concession, not in order to describe what reality is, but in order to evoke in the listener the taste of reality, the taste of their true nature, as Anne said, the taste of nature's eternity, to lead us to the experience rather than the idea of reality. And I think that's a valid, in fact, I can't think of anything as a human being that would be, I can't think of a higher endeavor than to explore the nature of reality and, to the best of one's ability, express it in some way, knowing that one is always going to fail to describe it.
No, I'm pleased you say that, and I think we're all grateful that you have taken that step and you've succeeded. I think very largely. I can imagine it's not always easy writing books like yours, particularly this one, which is in fact quite systematic and descriptive, and where you have to deal with some of these questions head on. It can't have been a very easy experience in some cases.
It's not an easy experience, but I've learned really this last 10 years or so of teaching, for want of a better word, although I don't ever think of it as teaching, but if somebody asks me a question that I asked 10, 15, 20 years ago, then it's relatively easy for me to answer. The way I imagine it to myself, it's like someone asking the question is lost in a particular place in the forest where I was once lost. I know just how to get home from that place in the forest. However, over these last 10 or 12 years or so, speaking about these matters, I've been asked many questions by people who are lost in the forest, in a part of the forest that I never visited. I didn't ask those questions because I was of a different makeup. My resistances, my objections were different from theirs. That would normally not matter unless one is in the position that I'm in, where one is responding to questions, teaching. And there I have had to, the first thing I have to do is find the person, find where they are. It's not a place that I've necessarily been to. So I first have to venture into the forest to find them. And then I have to walk back home with them along a path that I may not have walked on myself. So the whole process of teaching has taught me a lot in terms of listening to others and in terms of tailoring my understanding, such as it is, to questions that were not the questions that I asked. And this has really expanded my repertoire beyond what I needed during my own sadhana. I hope that this book was is the fruit of that.
Hmm. That's certainly how it comes over. I think I've got a fair number of books on non-duality. You will, I'm sure, know them all. A lot of them are questions followed by gnomic answers. They're interesting, they get you thinking, but if you come from a tradition where you quite like to have things laid out logically and sequentially, I think such books are less common. I was very impressed that you managed to do that with all of the difficulties that we've been talking about of understanding and so forth. I think that the book's a great success in that sense.
Thank you, David. I'm very heartened that you say that. I was under a misapprehension when, and as I think many people are, they go to a teacher, as indeed I did, thinking that a teacher is a bit like a maths professor or a history professor that has a kind of store of marvelous, enlightened knowledge, which they just dish out in response to questions. And I didn't realize that nothing could be farther from the case. When I go into a meeting, I go in empty of knowledge, and I have to listen carefully to the question and very often feel the question behind the question, and then respond in the moment. I have to tailor my understanding, such as it is, very uniquely to that question. Which means, and one doesn't reach into one's past for a response to such a question. What one reaches into the depths of one's present understanding, and then you have to marry your understanding, such as it is, with the question, and it provides a unique pathway in the moment for the questioner. And this is what keeps the non-dual teaching alive. It doesn't become a series of dogmas and practices, and it has to be. Really, of course, one cannot reinvent oneself from one day to another. So I have my repertoire of metaphors and language, but to the best of my ability, I'm always trying to respond in the moment and bring a fresh understanding. For instance, people sometimes say to me, "You must get bored of hearing the same question over and over and over again." I've never heard the same question twice. Every time I hear a question, I hear it like for the first time, and I try to answer it as if for the first time for that particular person at that particular moment in their lives. And I hope this keeps the teaching fresh. It's the traditional teaching. It's been around. There's nothing new in what I'm saying. It's the perennial understanding, but I'm tailoring it to the best of my ability to the moment in which I find myself. So it's both the ancient perennial understanding, but expressed in new ways that are tailored to the moment.
Yeah. I mean, there must be, I guess, particularly if you're someone like Plotinus, an enormous intellectual temptation to play games with this. It's so full of paradoxes, and all these paradoxes are so delightful. And you can't say this, but even if you could, you couldn't say that, because you lose yourself totally. I mean, you, in my experience, have resisted that temptation.
Well, I don't. It's not really. I don't feel it as a temptation because I'm not. I'm not interested at an intellectual level. I'm not really interested in kind of having debates with people about non-duality and arguing. And no, I'm motivated really by the heart and by people's heart. People that, and I find actually that very, very few people that come to me to debate and argue and prove me wrong. And people that come to me, that they're so sincere. They're either suffering terribly or they have a profound interest in the nature of reality that is not just an intellectual curiosity. It's a burning question for them, and it always has been for me.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear you say that. I think, yes, it's a fascinating intellectual exercise, but in the end, it leads nowhere.
Exactly.
A purely intellectual approach to non-duality leads you round and round in ever decreasing
absolutely
circles.
Yes.
And I think, I'm sure I speak for tens of thousands of people around the world when I say that we're very glad that you have the approach that you do. That you say you deal with issues from the heart. I have run out of questions. I don't know whether there's anything you think that we haven't covered, but we should have done.
Well, we've covered a lot, David. I think
I'll probably tired you out as well.
We've covered a lot, I think. Of course, we could go on indefinitely, but
Yeah.
we've covered a lot, I think.
Okay, well, I will switch the recording off now.